Good morning and good afternoon and good evening to all of you from, depending on where you're joining from. Uh, I think we'll begin this session as more people are joining in because the introductions itself will take a couple of minutes. I'm Manvi Singh. I work as Program Manager, Energy and Climate Change at iForest. That's the International Forum for Environment, Sustainability and Technology. And we're really delighted to host this webinar discussion today, and thank you all for joining in. For those of you who are unfamiliar with our work, iForest is an independent nonprofit environmental research and innovation organization, which has been established to identify, promote, and scale up solutions for pressing environment and development challenges. Just transition is a core area of work for us. We have been working with subnational governments, national government, and also at international level through a multi-pronged approach of research, policy engagement, public outreach, and capacity building around this issue. And given the multi-dimensional sort of nature of this initiative, we have also set up India Just Transition Center as a dedicated and comprehensive platform to in India to work on this issue. This webinar, an international cooperation framework for just transition, is being organized as a part of a webinar series on just transition at the backdrop of the ongoing COP. As you can see the agenda that we've circulated, we will begin with a quick briefing presentation on global collaboration on just transition, which is based on a working paper that we are developing. And this will be followed by a panel discussion moderated by Mr. Chandrabhushan, who's CEO iForest. We are quite honored to have a very diverse panel with us. We are joined by Dr. Robert Pollack, who's Senior Advisor with the EU Coal Regions and Transition Initiative. We have Mr. Mac Makwarela, who's Interim Secretary at Presidential Climate Commission, South Africa. We have Dr. Harshit Agarwal with us, who's representing World Bank, and he works as Senior Energy Specialist at the bank's Energy and Extractive Global Practices. And we also have, or will be soon joined by Dr. David Wood, who's Adjunct Lecturer in Public Policy at Harvard and directs the Initiative for Responsible Investment. Big thank you to all of you for joining. Before I begin my briefing presentation, I would request Mr. Bhushan to quickly summarize the context of this dialogue.
Thank you, Mandvi, and I welcome everyone who has joined this webinar. I think more people will join. This is the COP season. There are many events happening, and therefore people's attention is everywhere. So, but we think that this is a very important conversation that we are happy to initiate. And this conversation is about what kind of global cooperative framework is required for just transition. We have seen how Europe has understood this much before anyone else. And they have thought about a cooperative mechanism in terms of supporting countries and coal regions to transition to a green economy. This COP is also extremely important in terms of bilateral deals being made on just transition. And South Africa obviously has taken the lead in terms of getting together with donor countries to think about how coal phase out will happen in South Africa. I'm hearing similar kind of news from Indonesia and Vietnam. Vietnam, which is actually one of the fastest growing coal economies in Southeast Asia, is thinking about phasing out coal by 2040. Indonesia is also thinking about a conditional phase out of coal-based power. So there are coal-dependent economies who are now seriously looking at a path to phase out and do it in a socially, environmentally, and economically sustainable way, so that communities and workers and industries, can smoothly transition from the coal economy to a non-coal economy. Now, if this is happening bilaterally, there is obviously a space to think about a global framework. And a multilateral framework is something which will be of interest to many governments and many donors including non-governmental donor, philanthropists, private sector. There are many actors who will be keen to look at a multilateral framework on just transition. And we have been thinking about this framework for quite some time. I'm happy that my colleague Mandvi has done this paper. She will be presenting to you our initial ideas on what this global framework might look like. We are still debating whether it should be housed within UNFCCC, whether it should be a separate multilateral arrangement with a select number of coal-dependent economies. These are some of the issues which are still open for discussion, but nevertheless, an extremely important debate to start, because now the issue is not whether coal phase out will happen or not happen. That debate is over. Now the debate is, how do we get it done? And what kind of support and collaborative mechanism will be required to get it done? That's what the debate is. So thank you again for joining this webinar. And now I'll request Mandvi to present the paper. Thank you.
Thank you, Siddhi. I have a very quick presentation that I'll put up. So just picking up from where CB left, that it's very well established now that, you know, if coal phase out has to be achieved under accelerated timelines, what is needed for achieving the decarbonization goals, support to developing countries is absolutely necessary, and not just financial, but also technical support. So I will a little bit talk about the kind of support that is needed for achieving just transition, building upon the experiences of individual countries, and also collaboration experiences, like CB mentioned about Europe, and then a little bit on what can be leveraged and what new has to be created afresh. So just the background here is that, you know, compared to about 35 years ago, the share of OECD countries or developing countries has broadly reduced to 1/5 from, you know, starting with the same platform. We are looking at 1/5 share of these countries in coal consumption and production, while the share of non-OECD countries has increased to about 4/5. So accelerated action in developing countries becomes very important. And this has primarily happened because coal-based power plants or coal-based generation has increased nearly 7.5 times in non-OECD countries. We're talking about a very limited set of countries, and this is important to look at this where the coal comes from and where it is being consumed. Because if you look at the top 20 coal-dependent countries in the world, the upper, you know, the 7 upper middle income countries account for 62% of the coal production, and the lower income, there are 4 lower middle income countries that account for around 16 to 18% of coal production and consumption. And of course, these are dominated by China, India, Indonesia, South Africa. We see that a number of these countries have put up net zero targets, and in fact, all of them almost. But firm timelines for coal phase out are yet to be adopted. In this context, just transition becomes quite vital, because part of the reluctance towards coal phase out also stems from the fact that socioeconomic dependence in these countries is quite large, besides, of course, the overall energy security concerns. While expanding green energy sources itself is challenging, but just transition pathways are much more complex. We're talking about social, political, and economic strenuous exercise, because structural changes have to be introduced on incumbent systems, which requires a lot of effort. Broadly, just looking at what is this effort, just transition out of coal requires a comprehensive set of initiatives and sustained efforts in order to sort of shut down and repurpose existing coal assets, compensate and rescale workers and re-engage them, overhaul the local economy through green industries, then develop economic and social infrastructures, and then rehabilitate local environment, and as well as establish a governance framework that supports planning and management of this entire process. Now, all of this requires a very multidimensional approach, both in designing and delivering the optimal outcomes, wherein you need to customize the solutions, you need to engage at a multi-level, at a multi-stakeholder level, and build capabilities and capacities at institutional level, at individual level, introduce new age technologies, and support entrepreneurial development, as well as mobilize the required funding. Now, what we see, based on the individual country experiences so far, is that the multidimensionality of GT implementation is very clearly coming out. Now, this is, of course, very initial set of action which has happened even in these countries. But we see this very clearly. Majority of these countries already had a lot of social security related and environmental and economic rehabilitation related policies already in place, which got leveraged for just transition, but also new structures were created dedicated to just transition, just dedicated to coal regions, even in this initial stage. And here you can see what were these specific things happening in which specific countries. Another crucial element, of course, is funding. Again, the amount of funds required would vary from country to country, region to region, depending on a lot of context. But broadly, the experiences so far indicate that the cost components are substantially large, running into several $1 billion. We see that countries are expending a lot of money to persuade public and private operators to shut shop before the asset life cycle. The pre-decided ceiling, for instance, in case of Germany, ranges from about 165,000 euros per megawatt to 89,000 euros per megawatt. But in auctions, of course, the outcome was much lower than that. But that's not the case in Netherlands. The ceiling set there was about 328,000 per megawatt. But the coal companies were able to negotiate a price much higher than that. So a lot of variations across countries as far as this number is concerned. Similarly, labor-centric efforts are also very contextual, because the extent of effort varies substantially depending on existing social security structures, expectations of workers, and overall economic prosperity of the region. And labor unions, of course, play a very important role here. We know that labor unions in Spain were able to get a very good deal out. They were instrumental in pushing it out. Economic rebuilding is again very, very central to the entire transitional justice strategy. Germany has put up a package of 40 billion euros to diversify coal regions and to create new jobs over the next 2 decades. US, for instance, has also identified about $38 billion that can be leveraged from existing programs right away for revitalizing coal regions. Now, broadly, we see that there is a lot of effort put in the developing countries itself, so developed countries itself, in order to sort of achieve just transition pathways. But the effort required in developing countries is likely to be much more. And the reasons are that majority of coal plants in the developing regions have come up in the past decade and 15 years. Relative to that, if you look at the average age of coal plants in Europe and US, it's beyond 30 years. The employment dependence is also much higher. We're talking about roughly 2.5 million population that is dependent on coal in China, and roughly 2.7 billion population in India, million population that is dependent on coal-based power plants and mines in India, including both formal and informal sector. Relative to that, compared to that, in Europe, the population which is directly employed by a coal sector is about 138,000, and indirectly employed is about 215,000. Similarly, in US, the employment is limited to about 75,000 people. So we're talking about a much different scale. Now, the challenge is further compounded by the fact that coal economies, coal towns have typically remained fully coal industry dependent as far as economic and social infrastructures are concerned, and local governments have very limited capability to take up this exercise of social and economic re-engineering. Also, in developing countries, the coverage and efficiency of unemployment benefits and social security schemes is much more limited. We have the ILO data which says that relative to 61% population in northern, southern, and western Europe, which is covered by some sort of a social security scheme, the coverage in China is about 24%. It's about 12% in South Africa, and no such scheme is available in India and Indonesia. So new structures would need to be created entirely. Further, the challenge of raising funds and resources remains quite high due to overall lower development levels and limited capabilities of domestic financial markets. There is already a substantial dependence on external funds, especially development funds. India is already the largest beneficiary of development support. In 2019, it amounted to about $4 billion. China, Indonesia, and South Africa respectively have about 2 billion, 1.5 billion, and 1 billion coming in 2019. So there's a very clear case for support to be mobilized for these countries for achieving just transition. And there is a broad understanding which is already developing, as CB was talking about. So we do see cooperation taking shape. I've listed a few more. During this COP, we hear about more such cooperation frameworks being set up. We have the PPCA, which was set up a few years ago. There's the EU Coal Region and Transition Initiative, which got extended to the a new initiative which got extended to the Western Balkans and Ukraine as well. And more recently, we've seen developed countries collating to sort of support South Africa for coal transition. Now, this EU Coal Regions and Transition Initiative deserves a closer look for being quite comprehensive in its approach. For technical support, the initiative adopts a very inclusive bottom-up kind of approach to address the concerns of coal regions through primarily three key measures. There's an open forum set up for stakeholder dialogue, which includes community participation. Tailored technical assistance is being provided to coal regions through a needs-based co-creation approach to develop transition strategies, governance arrangements, develop strategies, as well as develop projects which needs to be prioritized, as well as find financing strategies. And to support further knowledge sharing, a repository of resources is also being created. In addition, funding support has been made available, which is quite crucial under the EU's Just Transition mechanism. This includes 1.7 billion euros, which have been set aside under a Just Transition Fund to mobilize additional 30 billion euros. There is a dedicated scheme under Invest EU, which is there to mobilize 10 to 15 billion in private investments. And then for mobilizing 25 to 30 billion of public investments, there's a grant financing and a loan financing being made available. All this, of course, requires, broadly, all this means that, when we look at the limited country level experience also, as well as the collaboration experiences, it emerges that the required support has to go beyond financing, and include capacity building at its core as well, which is something which needs attention. A collaborative framework that provides technical assistance is quite important, because low and income, middle income countries have very limited experience in executing these kind of exercises, these economic and social transformations, and they continue to struggle with the pre-existing development challenges as we've discussed. And the global experience and support can play a crucial role in selection of efficient transition pathways. And as well as an establishment of structures that can help build capabilities and capacities of institutions as well as individuals who are involved in this process. And most importantly, support initial pilot and demonstration projects that help stimulate further implementation. Now, this framework, of course, doesn't need to be built from scratch. It can be built upon intervention pathways that have already been established by multilateral and bilateral development cooperation experiences. And just that the multidimensional and the localized kind of approach would require this to be made more broad-based and consultative and inclusive of all national and subnational governments, as well as institutions, organizations, even in community representatives that are relevant to the conversation. Similarly, global financing support, the global financial support network would need to be built upon the existing pool of bilateral and multilateral development support and climate action funds. And we see a lot of this already happening. There are the multilateral and the bilateral agencies that have already been playing very central role in supporting implementation of SDGs in developing countries. And these agencies can sort of naturally take a lead in funding capacity building related works. And majority of just transition kind of requirements fall well within the purview of SDG agenda. And capacity development tool is in fact is quite central to their sort of overall operational strategy. Though what would be needed is specific programs for technical assistance that are designed and then negotiated with coal countries. We already see that World Bank has done that with CIL in India. We also know that GIZ is also looking to do on-ground work in India in this regard. So this is already taking shape in many ways. Development banks also have an important role to play in policy and program level funding to national and subnational governments. For institutional action for just transition, as well as project funding, especially for setting up economic and social infrastructures. What would be needed is dedicated sort of lending facilities and funding schemes for local coal region banks, businesses, governments, etc. ADB had recently announced that they are wanting to do more in the just transition space. That announcement was made fairly recently. Now, in addition to all that, existing climate funds can also be leveraged to support this work, because the climate just transition action falls quite within the overall objective and impact of these funds, whether they are within UNFCCC or outside of it. You can support clean energy, enhance livelihoods, fund health and well-being related projects, build climate resilience, etc., through these funds directly. We recently heard the Canadian Prime Minister. He has committed $1 trillion, in fact, to CIF for supporting coal transition in developing countries. So those kind of, again, announcements are happening and those are taking shape. What one can additionally consider is how carbon markets can be leveraged for this purpose by designing specific mechanisms where accounting of avoided carbon emissions can be done from shutdown coal power plants. Further dedicated incentives and investment schemes need to be established to mobilize substantial private funding. That would include, of course, established techniques of promoting investments through, say, designation of coal regions as special industrial estates or enterprise zones with tax breaks, easy land leases, etc. And these can be funded, these can be designed with multilateral and bilateral development agency support, while the funding can come in from national and state budgets or even backed by development banks. Private foundations can also be leveraged because a lot of the support activities which are crucial for just transition to take shape fall within their sort of area of interest and expertise, including building engagements, public policy deliberations, identification of optimal pathways, community outreach, awareness programs, capacity building, etc. These funds can also be utilized for demonstrating livelihood centered sustainable business and operator models that can then be scaled up, especially in the social infrastructure area. What additionally needs to be done is a dedicated resource pool needs to be set up for just transition, particularly focused on workforce. Now, this sort of global just transition support fund can provide the much needed funding facility for executing labor-centric interventions, such as direct compensations and re-employment schemes can be funded out of it that would otherwise have very limited kind of direct funding sources beside national budget or maybe local carbon tax funds. So this fund, of course, can be built in through contribution of Global North, as well as voluntary contributions from other governments, corporations, etc. So yeah, multiple avenues for are already available under the existing climate and development mechanisms, which can be built upon through additional commitments, as well as specific programs structured for GT support, while new mechanisms need to be set up, particularly for areas where existing mechanisms cannot naturally be leveraged. Lastly, to conclude, we do see a very strong case for international collaboration to be set up to push just transition in developing countries, not just to push the agenda at the top, but also to spearhead, coordinate, facilitate as activities of various sort of implementing agencies that are involved in the process. What we see as effectively needed for this collaboration to deliver is definitely participation of all coal-dependent developing countries, because that roughly captures about 80% of coal production. And if you take into account the top 20 countries, including all developed and developing countries, then you're talking about 96 to 94% of the entire coal consumption and production. It has to be a treaty-based approach, which tightly defines targets and plans of member countries, and clearly considering the country scenarios, priorities, coal technologies, development challenges, etc. It also has to have an effective burden sharing mechanism, which explicitly acknowledges the need for support for developing countries, and a dedicated multilateral just transition assistance fund that I was earlier talking about to meet the transition funding gaps wherever possible. UNFCCC can possibly take a lead in this. We saw during COP24 that 52 heads of states had signed the Silesia Declaration expressing support for just transition as being essential part of Paris Agreement and SDGs both. However, the challenge perhaps is that the negotiations-based framework is not really necessary. You do not probably need 175, 197 countries to agree upon coal phase out, because we really see that it's just 20 countries that we're talking about at the end of the day to effectively phase out coal. But this inter-country sort of collaboration, which is outside of UNFCCC, has to be strong and has to be backed by very broad-based kind of alliance, which includes firm commitments and dedicated funding to make it possible. Something aligned with what was done under Montreal Protocol for ozone depletion, because really the coal phase-out priority has reached that level of urgency. I will stop at that because, like CB said in the beginning, these are the initial ideas up for deliberations and considerations, and we hope to address some of these going forward in the discussion that follows. I'm happy to take questions at the end of this, during the Q&A round, but at this point, I'll hand it over to CB to take forward the discussions.
Thank you, Manvi, for this comprehensive presentation. As you can see, just transition essentially is about redevelopment. The idea which started as a labor support program has now got transitioned into a much broader idea of redevelopment of coal-dependent areas, because most of these coal-dependent areas are mono industries. And if you take out coal, there's nothing that is left there. Now, so from being a very specific formal labor transition, we are now talking about economic redevelopment. And therefore, all the tools and techniques that is required for development will have to be used here, both in case of capacity building, as well as in case of funding. So you will require large private and public investment, but you will also require large grant where public and private investment is not going to be available. You will require money which is available within the country, and there is significant amount of resources that is available within the country, but you will not be able to do this kind of transition without getting support and investment from outside. The capital that will be required for redevelopment is going to be significantly larger. As far as the governance framework is concerned, effectively 20 countries are involved in coal. If you address 20 countries, you will pretty much phase out all the coal, coal-based power plant and coal production. They account for more than 90% of production and consumption. So it is not actually an issue of 197 countries. It is about 20 countries that need to deal with this issue. But just transition will also move to gas and oil over the course of very quickly, actually. As I see it, right now we are talking about coal, but phase out of gas and oil is also going to happen very quickly if we are looking at net zero by 2050. There, the number of countries will increase a little bit more. We will move to about 40 odd countries then with large oil and gas consumption, but coal is about 20. So a multilateral framework that focuses on 20 countries with donor and recipient with a dedicated plan and a funding and capacity mechanism for us seems to be a much more practical framework than thinking about a framework involving 197 countries. Okay, then you are getting into the entire UNFCCC politics of 30 years, which might not be very productive. Now, having said that, I think these are the issues that the panelists here will be able to address and put their thoughts on the table. I have an excellent group of panelists for this discussion. As Mandvi said, we have Robert Pollock from EU Coal Region in Transition, Mr. Mac Makbarela from Presidential Climate Commission of South Africa, Harshit Agarwal from World Bank, and David Wood from Initiative for Responsible Investment. So we have two countries, one which has a collaborative mechanism, second which has signed a deal on just transition just few days back, and we will hear from them. We have someone from World Bank which will talk to us about bank and its perspective on just transition. It has started program in Indonesia and India and what the World Bank is thinking about investments in just transition. And we have David who will look at the wider issue of responsible investment in this entire thing. So let me start the panel discussion with Robert. Robert, you have 8 to 10 minutes of initial comment. I would like to finish this first round of comments from all the panelists, say by 7:05, 7:10 India time, and then I'll take a round of questions. So Robert, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Chandra, and we'll try to keep within 10 minutes. And can I just say I'm delighted to have been invited onto the panel today, and I really admire the work that you're taking forward with iForest, and also I found the presentation quite inspiring about the potential opportunities for greater international cooperation. But as Chandra noted, I work for the European Union's Coal Regions in Transition initiative. The initiative has been going for 4 years, and we work with approximately 35 coal regions across the European Union. And these are quite a diverse set of regions. Some are quite rural regions, others are quite urbanized, some are quite mono-industrial in nature, and some have a more diversified economy. So it's hard to generalize about the types of regions that we work in. The Coal Regions in Transition initiative has a number of objectives, and Manvi referenced them in our presentation. Firstly, it's very much about bringing regions together to collaborate, to network, to share, to learn. We also have an objective to promote communication, effective and timely communication between the regions. So we have regular newsletters just updating on progress in terms of coal phase out. But in terms of the other two objectives, we have a very practical focus. We provide regional practitioners and regional policymakers with toolkits to assist in transition. So we have toolkits for governance, strategy development, site rehabilitation, repurposing, labor market, welfare reform, funding, etc. I could go on. And the fourth objective, again, that is very practically focused, is technical assistance to the regions, providing technical assistance. And I lead in that regard. And we focus on 4 broad themes: strategy development, project identification and development, governance, and capacity development. And one of the things which I was pleased Manvi picked up on was very much the emphasis on co-creation. We believe that technical assistance has to be a process of co-creation. It's about bringing expertise and knowledge to our region, but very much working in partnership to develop solutions together. So today I'd just like to stand back and reflect on the Co-Regions in Transition initiative and the determinants for effective delivery of support and assistance to co-regions in Europe. And I will try and keep it quite brief, but to generalize, I recognize sort of 4 determinants for successful delivery of support or effective delivery of support. They relate to contextual comprehension of the region's situation, multi-actor engagement, regional specific planning, and finally, regional capacity for implementation. And I'd just like to go through them in turn and just share a few insights. In terms of contextual comprehension, one of the things which we've recognized over the last 3 or 4 years is the need to understand the region's place in time, by which I mean you have to understand the history of a region, where it has come from, but you also have to understand the speed of change within the region. Some regions we've been working with are in the throes, they're in the immediate moment of mine closure and power plant closure, a very tense and anxious period for the delivery of technical assistance. Some other regions actually anticipate coal phase out in 10 or 20 years' time. Now that is actually quite a problematic group to work with of regions because they're in denial. And one of the things which we've learned in Europe is transition has a habit of accelerating. So communities that thought they had 10, 20 or 30 years due to changing policies and market dynamics suddenly have the situation accelerated upon them, and they're dealing with transition within a 3 to 5 year window. And so time is a great resource for support. You have to use it as a resource. Use it wisely. The other temporal dynamic I'd like to discuss is the long-term nature of transition. I think policymakers, communities, politicians hope that transition can be achieved in a 5-year period. But from our experience in Germany, Belgium, the UK, actually, it can take a generation, if not longer, for true transition to occur. So transition planning is quite a long-term process. The second contextual consideration I'd like to touch on is institutional comprehension. You have to understand the political structure in which transition is occurring. So if you're working in a decentralized political structure or a very centralized political structure, that will influence how you design the processes, because you have to work where power lies to affect change. The other thing which I would say about institutional context is the need to work with other aid providers and multilateral actors. So one of the things which we do whenever we're in a region is reach out to other multilateral actors, whether that be the World Bank, whether that be the European Bank, whether that be other departments within the European Commission. The next point I'd like to raise is the need for multi-actor engagement. One of the things which we've recognized that is vital for effective support is to recognize the breadth of actors involved, not just public sector, not just private sector, but also civil society. And you must identify the affected groups and take some time to understand the impact on various groups. I must say that one of the key actors that we've really engaged with and found instrumental to the process of change over the last 3 years are NGOs. NGOs have become critical in our co-creative approach to energy transition. My final point in terms of multi-actor engagement is we need models of transition that are both top-down but also bottom-up. In terms of the top-down, we have to harness the instruments, the resources, the finance of the state, and by which I mean both national and international state structures. But we also, in terms of the bottom-up, have to harness the ideas and the ambitions of local communities. My next point in terms of determinants of successful support is planning the process of transition. And as I mentioned earlier, it's vital that that is a co-creative process, engaging the technical experts from outside the region with the communities and actors within the region. I think all good planning must have a vision, a clear long-term plan of where the region wants to be. And as I said, it's a long-term journey. But I think one of the key elements is that vision has to be underpinned with quantification of the challenge and quantification of the opportunities. And we see that a lot in the European regions that really understand the scale of the problem and the scale of the solution. On planning, I would just like to say that one of the things which we are passionate about is the need to avoid almost cookie cutter solutions or one size fit all solutions. All regions are different, they're highly heterogeneous, therefore you need bespoke plans. And that may annoy many consultants, but if you try and apply a standard methodology or try and just overlay plans from other regions, you will have a very suboptimal outcome. And it touches also again on that presentation we saw earlier. Transition is more than just about social security. It's more than just compensation. It's more than just specific regional investments. It's about holistic change within regions. And that requires quite a high degree of sophisticated planning and wide social dialogue. My final point is probably in regard to implementation and what we feel are determinants of successful implementation. Each region must have the capacity to deliver. There's no point having sophisticated analysis and plans if there is not the capacity to deliver. And there has to be multi-scalar coordination of resources. And we're beginning to come to terms with that in the European Union. With the development of the Just Transition Mechanism and the Just Transition Fund and the monies available, we're now looking at in a much more sophisticated way of how we actually bring together local funds, regional funds, national funds, and trans-European funds into a holistic package of funding to support the planning process that I just spoke with. The other final issue in regard to determinants of success is the pipeline of projects. You need projects that you can deliver in the short term, that mitigate the initial impact of transition, and also give hope to the communities and the actors on the ground that things are happening, but you have to begin to understand the longer term projects. And some of these large energy projects, large infrastructure projects take years to design. The full business cases can take 3 to 4 years, let alone the release of the procurement and the initiation of the project. So you have to have a pipeline of projects. So things are happening immediately, but you've got a clarity about what's happening in the longer term. I'm conscious of time, Chandra, so I'll leave it there. And perhaps in the questions, I can come on to the whole question of cooperative frameworks.
David, I would just like to ask one question before, and then come back later to you. The question I have is, EU has started looking at just transition beyond its borders now. EU has a program in Balkans in terms of support. How do you see this entire movement within Europe to build capacity, support countries outside EU, panning out over the next few years? Do you think it, morphing into some global, a support program?
I can imagine that, Chandra. I can actually see how the lessons of the EU's Just Transition Program are now being transferred to the Western Balkans and Ukraine. And I can appreciate how I can see opportunities for transferring those lessons and experiences to a wider global context, obviously done with sensitivity and humility. The other thing which I would like to add is that actually I think it cuts both ways. I think there's things we can learn from a wider dialogue about co-transitions. So for example, I think a key lens for understanding transition is community development. It's not just about economic development, it's also about community development. And I think there's things we can learn from the global south about community wealth building, about well-being economy principles, and about social capacity. So to answer your question, I think there is an appetite and an opportunity for widening the scope, the geographic scope of our activities. But I think actually the benefits cut both ways. It's not just us transferring knowledge or experience I think there's a real need for Europeans to also adopt experiences and lessons from other territories.
Thank you. Thank you. So our next panelist is Mac, Mr. Mac Macbarella. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, sir. And a good day to my fellow panelists and all those who are in attendance. I work for the Presidential Climate Commission here in South Africa as an interim secretary, assisting with the establishment of this newly established commission. We were formed last year in December and only start to function early this year. So we are fairly new, a new kid on the block. The commission worked through what we call the multi-stakeholder constituencies, where we have commissioners coming from the government, labor, NGO, academia, business, youth, and many other sectors. And this came as an idea from the Presidential Job Summit, which was held in 2018, to say we acknowledge that we must transition to low carbon economy and climate resilient society by 2050. But with that, there will be impacts that will need to be managed. And as such, we need a body that will oversee and coordinate just transition in the country. And that was the birth of the commission. So we have not done much in as far as the activities are concerned. Of course, there were milestones like the contribution and the recommendation that we made to the president on the revised nationally determined contribution. We also made input in support of the framing of the energy just transition transaction that everyone is talking about now. I must say that the announcement that was made last week, maybe one needs to correct this to say this is more of a political declaration with the intention to implement this. So it's not yet a signed deal that one can already describe the architecture and the design of the financial mechanism that will support this pledge. So we have this as a proposal whereby the countries involved will work with us in the next at least 6 months to finalize this deal. But what is on the table is the $8.5 billion that will be used to mobilize finances in the next 3 to 5 years, and of course with a long-term view support to South Africa. And the majority of these investments will go to support the Eskom, which is the power utility in the country. And our view is that the support will increase the alternative options for power sources for Eskom. It will also allow the access to energy, security of supply, and the risks of load shedding. As we are speaking now, in South Africa, we are on stage 4 load shedding. So from time to time, the electricity will be shared between towns or region, which is impacting badly on the economy. And of course, this will improve the air quality in the regions where there is heavily dependency on coal. And we see this pledge as a game changer in that it shall also assist us in addressing some of the sustainable development goals. Here I'm talking about poverty, unemployment, and inequality. I mean, those who are following South African history will know that we have adopted the inequalities emanating from the apartheid era. When it comes to unemployment, we are sitting at about 34% unemployment rate in the country, of which the 64% of our youth are unemployed. So we are in a very bad situation here in the country when it comes to those triple challenges that we are faced with as a country. So we see this pledge contributing to a just transition where the business, labor, and the targeted programs will be developed that will help workers that are currently employed and those that are unemployed, women and youth, being the beneficiary as we shift to this greener technologies. And one thing that we think will come out from this arrangement is the lessons for the world. And we see ourselves creating a template on how to implement just transition, collaboration between developed and developing countries. But it is also interesting maybe to share how we managed to secure this commitment with the other countries. I must say, what convinced these countries that they must support us is that we managed to present a very good plan, long-term plan. For example, if I'm to zoom into the power sector as an example, our power sector planning is regulated through what we call the integrated resource plan. And we, in that plan, have indicated that we will be decommissioning a number of power stations that are delivering coal between now and 2030. For example, Eskom plans to retire at least 22 gigawatts of coal by 2025 already. And we have invited these countries to come and visit us. Their last visit was in September this year. And we were able to demonstrate this plan and the progress that have been made, because it is also very important to demonstrate that there is something already happening on the ground. It's very important for us in that the region that will be impacted by this transition, it's a not so big region in terms of economic activities. The economic activities of this region is built around coal. So if you take away a coal from this region, then the economic activities of those region will collapse. Hence, it is important to focus on this region as we start to demonstrate that there is something that we can do, and with government and many other players, ESCOM, for example, have already started programs like reskilling, upskilling of workers, and there is a huge community or a full ecosystem that depends on the existence of these coal-fired power stations for livelihoods. So it is important that as we look at this, we also looking at developing the new enterprises in these towns that are historically dependent on the coal value chain. And we're not just looking at the coal as a commodity, but the full ecosystem. And there are opportunities that one is looking at in terms of this economic diversification. Opportunities such as rehabilitation of coal mining or coal mines, they do have opportunities that can give jobs to the locals. There are other opportunities that are coming in now. For example, with one power station that we want to move away from coal, we are repurposing this to focus and integrate agriculture into the energy generation. So here we have a power station that is focusing on coal, on power generated from coal. Now we'll be using solar to generate electricity, but we also using this land that we be using to generate electricity to also cultivate crops. So the initiative here is to ensure that the gantries that are used to support the solar panels are tall enough to allow the tractors and the agricultural activities to happen underneath those gantries. And we are engaging with communities and the farmers in terms of what are the suitable crops that we can plant in this power station that were initially used for generating electricity from coal.
So, Mr. I just wanted to ask, we will come back to a round of question where we will do a much more detailed dive into what is this 8.5 billion deal. So is there any other point that I would like to make right now?
Yes, I think the other points to indicate is that when we talk about just transition, we are not just talking about the energy or power sector. There are other sectors that we are also looking at, and there is a transition in the transport sector, for example. We are also looking at the hydrogen economy. For an economy such as ours, we are situated in or located in Africa, and the IPCC reports, for example, are telling us that Africa will experience severe impact when it comes to climate change, and there's a need for us to build adaptation and resilience capacity. And as such, when we talk of just transition, we just not look at mitigation issues, but also adaptation. And the 8.5 billion that we are talking about, of course, it's a start, but it's very little in terms of the needs that we want to address going forward. I mean, from the presentation that has been just given now, if you look at Germany, they're talking about around 50 billion euros to save about just 20,000 jobs. And here we're talking about 100,000 jobs in that region. So you can imagine the magnitude of support needed for
absolutely, that. Absolutely. I will come back to you with few questions later on. Okay, may I now request Harshit for his intervention. Harshit, 10 minutes, please.
Sure. Thanks, Chandra and Manvi, for organizing this session. I'm Harshit Agarwal, Senior Energy Specialist at the World Bank, based in Washington, D.C. Let me start by saying that the topic of just transition in developing countries is very personal to me. I actually grew up in a mono-industry town in Western India, which suddenly became deserted because of profitability concerns. And I saw how the widespread job losses led to economic disruption, which really rips the fabric of community apart. So it is our collective duty to ensure that in years to come, the closure of coal assets do not result in establishment of lasting socioeconomic lagging regions, right? And with proper and long-term planning, which Robert referred earlier as well, countries can achieve a just transition for all. But we need to ensure that impacted workers and communities are part of that planning, preparation, and implementation. Yeah. It is also important to note that what we see on the table is that this process does not emerge as naturally. It has to be closely managed and coordinated across a diversity of stakeholders. Countries and regions we are discussing here, the 20 countries, would need support from international community in this complex closure process, so that the workers and their societies are continuously support across years of transformation, which will happen. The World Bank teams, like Robert mentioned earlier, have been supporting national, regional, and local authorities globally through several lending operations. For example, we had experience in Russia, Ukraine, Poland, Romania, totaling around 2.5 billion in lending. And we have learned from these operations. We have continuously refined our framework for just transition for all. And to summarize, it basically has three strong pillars. The first is on institutional governance, which we need to strengthen. The major pillar is on people and communities, which is to support the mining communities and people. And then finally is to ensure that the environmental remediation and repurposing of former lands and assets happens in a responsible manner. And like we talked about the pipeline of projects, the framework has to be implemented in 3 phases. Initially, the pre-closure planning, where we do a lot of technical assistance, knowing the context of the local sub-regional areas, and then really planning closure of coal assets and learning from them to do the regional transformation, which is most essential. And we have a great enabling environment at this moment. We are committed to work with coal producing and consuming countries of all sizes, and it is clear that we need to put people and environmental at the center of that planning. So in respect of time, let me thank you and Manvi for the earlier presentation. It is clear that just transition is a massive exercise, requires immense funding, and requires multi-level, multi-agency planning and support. And while we learn from what developed nations are doing on just transition, like Mac mentioned, we will not be successful unless coal regions and developing nations also join this movement. Yeah. So let me stop there, and I could address other aspects such as financing and question and answers. Over to you, Chandra.
Harshit, just one question. We have had this news that World Bank there's a pipeline of $1 billion lending program for just transition that World Bank has signed with Government of India. Would you like to shed some light on that?
So yeah, I mean, all the programs which World Bank leads is through support to the governments. So we have, Ministry of Coal has been looking at coal mine closures in certain regions. And this program is still in a discussion, but what we'd love to do is, understand like what we were talking about, pipeline of projects. So start and learn from initial pipeline of mines which will be closed due to profitability issues, and initially funding would be needed to support affected parties, labor, and mine owners, and then we support the economic rehabilitation of coal regions. So that is still work in progress, but there is a great enabling environment to support the mines which will close due to profitability issues. And like Manvi mentioned earlier, we have to work bottoms up on this. So really communities first and people first.
Good, thank you. I just want to say that actually World Bank has a long-term experience of looking at mine and people's rehabilitation for coal mining areas. In fact, there was a long-term grant program of World Bank to look at rehabilitation and resettlement of people for some of the mining that the World Bank had funded. And one of the outcome, and then there was a review of that. And it's a very interesting report that came out on the work of rehabilitation and resettlement of the World Bank. And I distinctly remember one of the recommendation was that the focus only on physical infrastructure is not going to get you the kind of outcome you are looking at. You have to invest both in soft as well as hardware. So software investment is as important as hardware investment. And we at times forget that while hardware investment is visible and seen, maybe the long-term impact is from software investment, investing in people and communities, which becomes very important.
Yeah,
Let me now with this come to David, because David talks about responsible investments. And David, your take on the entire global framework, global cooperative mechanism on just transition. How do you see investment in just transition, panning out over the next couple of years and decades?
Yeah, great. Thanks. And thanks you all for your presentations and for the organizers for having me. So I work at the Kennedy School at Harvard on a project called the Initiative for Responsible Investment. And with our colleagues at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the London School of Economics, we have been looking at one slice of this much broader challenge of structural transformation. And that's the world of private, largely institutional investment, but also development finance and mission-driven investment in supporting a just transition, which we define as an intersection of labor and community, or bringing the issue of inequality into climate-related investment. So we have one little piece of the puzzle, but I think it's relevant here, especially when we talk about how funding flows are meant to support place-based development. And I'll try to be brief. We had a conference. It's hard to be brief. We had a conference last week where we sort of reviewed everything that's been going on in the last few years on just transition with investors, and it's a lot. It's not nearly enough, but it's a lot. I would say in the institutional investment community, just transition has now become a topic of discussion. It has yet to become maybe an object of action. But the fact that just transition is part of the Paris Accords is widely acknowledged. And there's an understanding, I think, in the investors who are really active that just transition can't be something that's tacked on to a climate agenda or a net zero agenda. A lot of investors have signed on to net zero for their own portfolios and engaging in their corporations. And just transition isn't yet central to that, but it's moving that way. And the evidence we've seen of action is often through investor or shareholder engagement. So we've done some work with utilities and talked a lot with South African colleagues about Eskom as well. That was fascinating to hear. Utilities are labor dense, so they have organized labor. They're sort of attached to communities, and they have a license to operate questions, which allow them to kind of think about the intersection of what it means to decarbonize. But in their net zero plans, they don't have workers or communities at all represented, really. What would it mean for the utility sector to, as they plan for decarbonization, integrate social considerations into those plans? That's starting to take place. We've seen some assessment mechanisms for just transition coming out of investor actions like Climate Action 100 Plus or the World Benchmarking Alliance, which I think maybe offer models for development finance, but also for the planning that Robert and Harshit were talking about as potential models for thinking about what just transition means. And also we've seen in the transition to renewable energy, more attention paid to the quality of the jobs being created rather than just counting the jobs being created. These are all things that I think investors are bringing to the table. maybe the most important thing they're bringing is participation in and acknowledgement of much broader multi-stakeholder dialogues. So one of the stories that we heard last week at the conference was of how the Scottish Just Transition Commission created the framework which allowed Royal London Asset Management to engage SSE on a net zero plan that was a just transition plan. And I think that sort of set of dominoes where the multi-stakeholder planning upfront leads to investor action is we're also hearing similar things in South Africa about the way that'll work. There is some investor action. I think it can be channeled. I think it can support place-based planning, but investors aren't going to lead. I think it's going to be public development banks and development finance that creates the opportunities for institutional investment flows that move towards just transition or not. And the emphasis should be on design that allows these interested investors to move because they won't be at the lead of product development, especially in emerging markets. And I think we need a much stronger voice from investors about the necessity of social cohesion as a precondition for a net zero transition. Right now, that's the sort of a tacked on to net zero, and it needs to be much more direct. And I'll just end with a couple challenges for doing that. You know, one, as Harsha just said, the scale of the problem is so massive. We're talking about billions of dollars and trillions of dollars problem. Structural economic transformation is really hard. We know how to do it badly. I think the Rust Belt in the United States shows us how to do it badly. We ought to not do that again. And I think that will involve investors, but it's going to involve a whole lot of other people too. In my little world of the institutional investment discussion, the conversation has been way overweight developed markets and way overweight coal. I think the concentration here on the 20 countries in developing markets with coal is a great way to move the global discussion to where it needed to be, because right now it's sort of centered in this idea of coal country in the U.S. or in Europe or in Australia, and that means more place-based work and following leadership from the global South rather than sort of coming in with ideas and plans. But it also means tracking just transition across supply chains, so that as we move to a low carbon automotive sector, we're thinking about what the implications for mining for those minerals are. And then the last, I'll say two more things. One, private investment, just to reiterate, I feel this gets lost in my world because we just talk with investors. It's just one tool and it's not going to be enough. And we need massive amounts of public finance and direct spending and grant making to make this happen. And we're nowhere near it. If you believe, as I do, that the urgency is so profound it's hard to stay asleep at night, we're not seeing that response. I think investors have to do everything they can too, but it won't be enough, and they need to be led. Secondly, there really is a challenge in thinking about the social dimensions of climate investment, because the social is figured as too hard, or it's too political, or we don't know how to engage with workers, or we don't know how to have communities lead. But it's really hard to count Scope 3 emissions too. The idea that the challenges are harder on the climate side is I think, it's a sort of ideological conception that we need to break through, because it's all really hard and it's all necessarily integrated. And until we have a holistic view of what planning and development looks like in communities that allows for a transformation from carbon intensive to low carbon intensive practices, we're not going to mitigate emissions either. So thanks for having me. I really am so delighted that you all are working on this, and honored to be a part. You're on mute, Chandra.
I just have in your conference, was there any discussion on the quantum of resources that would be required? Any rough figure that people were talking just for coal?
I don't recall that anyone, if I've understood the question correctly, that people put a number on the resources, because there was no number. It sort of felt like one of those things where the actual resources required were so far beyond what was considered politically plausible to put forward that people didn't put a number on it.
Well, that's an excellent answer, because right now, the scope of this transition is something I don't think that most people have visualized. because it was all initially about formal workers and how do you close coal mines and coal power plant and provide them with social security and those kind. But the moment you are moving to informal economy, the formal worker are a tiny little piece, of course, bigger than in number than developed world. But the informal could be 5, 10 times more than formal economy. The entire scope of transition changes considerably. But I think that's a good answer, that we haven't even started looking at the scope of what is required. Now, we have few questions. We have 10 minutes left for our deliberation, 15 minutes. I have a list of questions that I would like to ask my panelists. But before that, there are a few questions that, there is one question which is there from Mauro Pucheta. And this question is both to Harshit and Manvi. And you can read that question. Question essentially is, do you think multilateral lending institutions should play a more proactive role and consider request of developing and middle income countries in terms of debt relief to promote sustainable development and implement just transition strategies? This is largely on debt relief issue. Harshit, do you like to take a shot on this question?
Sure, yeah. And first, let me start with the conversation which you were having with David as well. I mean, the quantum of amount needed to implement just transition in developing world, I mean, I don't think there is a clear answer to that question. I mean, there's only learning from what Germany has put forth, what Australia has put forth, and it's very hard to draw that analogy to bring that to developing nations. Like you mentioned, informal to formal employees numbers in India is 3, 4, 5 times than what is there. We'll have to consider cost power parity as well. To answer the question around debt relief, we'll have to find innovative mechanisms to come up with providing support. What I do see is that multilateral institutions have few important roles to play, and not just on financing, right? I think mobilizing concessional financing, which David was mentioning, to leverage funds from several donors, private investors. There's opportunity with multilateral institutions to just put in some amount of money that can leverage huge amount of money from counterparts, from donors, and private investors. So that needs to be leveraged, but also about bringing this global knowledge, gathered from supporting governments globally. And then finally, to use the strong convening power, bringing various stakeholders together. That's also important. So, I mean, it is clear from the World Bank side that we have a strong enabling environment. Our president has clearly mentioned that it'll be core to our strategy to support global developing countries in terms of supporting the transition away from coal. So yeah, I mean, not a clear answer to the question, but I think the innovative solutions needs to be emerged. And while we do this pipeline of projects, we'll do some pilots. We'll start working on it, and then we learn from it. Because there's no cookie cutter approach, like Robert mentioned. Things the way it's done in Europe, we can learn from it, but can't apply directly in India. I mean, yeah, the level of understanding of coal transition, the terminology of just transition is not there within the public. It's there in the academia, it's there within us, but people don't understand it. So the same kind of questions cannot be asked there. Let me stop there.
Okay, Manvi, did you look at the issue of debt relief in your paper? Because one of my experience of green investment is actually in Tanzania. And Manvi, remember we did a project in Tanzania together, and I went to the central bank, and the bank, the manager there, a very senior person, told me that, sir, do you know how much interest rate we pay for solar panels? And I said, no. And he said, if you want to buy, a private individual wants to put a solar panel on the rooftop, he has to pay 18% interest rate. And think about 18% interest rate on someone interested in putting a solar panel on his roof compared to 0% interest rate in some of the developed countries. It changes the dynamics completely. It makes green investment extremely, extremely expensive in developing countries, just the cost of capital. So, Manvi, just did you look at the issue of cost of capital, concessional loan, debt relief in your paper?
No, CB, in fact, thank you, Mayuru, for pointing this out, and maybe we can add that, since the working paper is still in a draft stage. because it is an important aspect to explore, especially with all the developing countries that we are focusing on in the context of coal. Like Harshit pointed out that, the whole aspect is very contextual. As far as just transition is concerned, becomes very difficult to generalize and put things there. Innovations would be required depending on what the context of the country is, and whatever is needed in order to push the agenda would need to be done. So I think definitely, CB, we will take that into account. Yeah.
Okay, I have a question for South Africa, actually, Mr. Makaverela. You hint at that 8.5 billion is too small a amount. You did talk about, I'm hearing a lot about hydrogen mission of South Africa and other green nature-based investment that South Africa plans to do. I want you to come back a little bit more and detail out a little bit more in terms of the overall just transition that you're looking at. I know that it is beyond energy, but a little bit more if you can add to that description.
Okay, so thanks for that. This is linked to the question around the estimation of the cost for just transition, to say it cannot be a plug and play, for example, copying experiences from Germany and play them in South Africa, for example, because the context is very different. For example, if I'm just to look at the coal value chain, the sector is employed a number of people who are either not skilled or semi-skilled. These are people who do not have matric or degrees. And when it comes to salaries that they are getting compared to other industries, it's almost double what they are getting compared to other counterparts industry. For example, a person with a degree in the sector will get double the salary of someone who is in the another sector. So that makes it very difficult to convince people from the coal value chain to say, as we move away from coal, you will have this new job in this sector. So that cost also needs to be factored in as we transition from, away from coal. The other areas that we are talking about as we're talking about transition, it's issues around water security, for example. Those are the issues that we also need to look at. There's also an issue around land, the availability of land for people to first build housing, because there are a number of people who do not have the basic needs around housing, for example, that we also need to talk about that. The other issue is that the mobility of people will be impacted by the transition. As I've indicated, the regions that are impacted, it's a small region, but it employs a lot of people, and these people are dependent on this coal value chain commodity. Unfortunately, where there's high intensity of sun, or we have high-speed winds that we can use to harvest wind for renewable energy, it's on the other side of the country. We're talking about the other provinces, which is the Northern Cape, very far from Mpumalanga, which is impacted region or coal region. We are also talking about Western Cape and Eastern Cape, which is wind-rich resource region. And the people who are employed in this impacted region won't be able to move to those other regions, for example, for the same money that they're receiving on the other side. So it is a a catch-22 situation for us. But also,
please quickly.
Also, I touched on adaptation.
Okay.
Adaptation is very important for us, because otherwise, if we don't invest in adaptation and building resilience, we will undo all the good things that we are doing from the mitigation side. So as we invest in mitigation, we must also be thinking about adaptation.
David, your last thoughts on Robert, your last thoughts on a global collaborative mechanism. Anything that struck you when you were reading the paper, and something that you'd like to suggest?
Yeah, I would. Thanks for bringing me in. Unfortunately, I have to leave right on the hour, because I've actually got a meeting with the Scottish Just Transition Minister on the other side of Glasgow. So I'm going to be cutting it fine for the Minister. Sure. So I'll leave quite quickly. So thank you. So I just want to say it's been a very rich discussion, and I did enjoy reading the paper. A few things struck me and have resonated. This is wider than the paper, but it comes up in the discussion that we've just had. And that is, what do we mean by just transition? I think one of the things that I've realized by spending nearly 2 weeks at COP is it's a compound concept, and it's also a contested concept, and it's very context specific. And one of the things which worries me is I've heard a lot of glib language. No community left behind, no individual left behind. And as someone who actually works in communities that have had their mines and power plants closed, language like that is not that helpful. So I think we need a more sophisticated taxonomy of what we mean by just transition in different stages of the transition cycle. So that's just one general point. But I actually think that the platform that you're suggesting, the cooperation framework, could help with that and bring real vitality and life to the notion of what we mean by just transition and different concepts. But I do think, thinking about the EU platform for co-regions in transition, I think something like this could work globally. I think there's a lot of strength in it being regional, as that is where, there's a lot of variety, as I've spoken earlier, at the regional level that has to be considered and planned for. And so I think a platform that is both global, national, but regional, has a regional context, would be very useful. I think such a mechanism or such a framework needs facilitated, it needs resourced, and it could be focused around learning, engagement, networking, and sharing of good and bad practice. And we talk a lot about good practice, but it's very hard to share bad practice. But that's where the real lessons are often. I also think we need something around culture. We need to create a collaboration between the various multilateral bodies. And I think your global initiative, your global framework your international framework could achieve that. And I did like the focus areas: knowledge, resources, and capacity. I thought that they were an excellent agenda for change. So I thought it was a very rich paper, and I'm not doing it any justice, but I thought it was a real step forward. So I'll leave it there, Chandra.
Thank you, and I hope to see you soon.
I'd like to think so.
Thank you. Sure. David, now coming back to you, David, your intervention on the global framework from an investment perspective, if you will.
Yeah, so I too, I'm not going to do justice to the paper, but I thought it was great. And I was very much appreciated I just think you're at the right level of integration where you can create enough scale, but also have something that's workable and there's enough trust. From the investor side of things, I think you have an opportunity around a global mechanism to work on the kinds of relations between public and multilateral development finance and institutional investment that's concerned with just transition that hasn't really been built yet. So this is just one piece of the puzzle, but I think the understandings between those two are often reduced to blended finance and some design question, but really it's going to require much stronger relationships and trust between investors, development finance, and the people planning for a just transition for anything to move at scale. So that might be something to work into your framework, but it doesn't change much what you have. And again, I think Robert's right. The kind of regional design that layers up from local and down from global is the right scale with which to put one foot in front of the other for this big challenge.
Okay, thank you. I think we have reached the time. We have, and it has been an engaging discussion. Some very interesting ideas that have come up. Manvi will look at it. I'll give the last word to Manvi and request her to close the meeting.
No, thank you so much to everyone for joining in, all our panelists. It's COP time, it's busy time. I know that there are multiple webinars and discussions going on. So yeah, thank you for this very rich discussion. Two of our speakers have already dropped off, but there are some questions, if they're still pending, I will try and address them separately. There's one from Shrestha, but maybe Shrestha, we take it up with Harshit directly later. So yeah, I think it's a good point to close this discussion. And of course, whatever has come up, we'll certainly be including that in our working paper going forward, and that will be circulated again through our direct emails, etc. And we'd like to get more feedback from more readers, of course, in terms of how better we can frame this international global cooperation for it to be taken up at a more focused policy kind of decision-making kind of level.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you very much. Thanks to all our panelists and whoever was there in the audience. Thank you very much for joining the meeting. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks to you all. Bye now.
Thanks.